Hello, my name is Isaias Cruz. I'm talking about the story of Latinos in the United States. Also drawing parallels of Latinos in the United States to other communities that we've talked about in class. I first wanted to talk about the history of Latinos, and then go into further detail to the connections that, or the similarities it shares with other communities. So before Second Ward was named Second Ward, there was already a group population there living there already. After the Civil War, Germans, Europeans mostly, but at that time, the area was mostly dominated by Germans, began to live there first. They were the first communities to live there, along with other European ethnicities. They began to live there. And they were there for a while, up until World War I. And with World War I, the United States saw the Germans as the enemy, and various laws and acts were passed at that time. One of the main ones was the Espionage Act that really affected the Germans in that area. Even before the Espionage Act, the Europeans had made their culture there. Since the dominant culture there was the German culture, they had their own organizations, they had their own groups, they had their own festivities, they had their own, it was just their area. But as a result of the Espionage Act, this began to drive out the Germans in that area because of the anti-German laws and the hate that the war brought. And as a result, the Latino population began to move in there. And of course, at that time in the 1810s, the Mexican Civil War was occurring, and many Latinos wanted to escape the war, the bloodshed, the death in that area. So as a result, they began to move into Texas. They weren't really recorded until later in the 1910s, when the census was being recorded, with them recognizing that, there's a lot of Latinos moving into this area. And typically these Latinos, they were just wanting to escape the Civil War, but also looking for jobs throughout the Houston area, while the Latinos really moved in wherever they could. The most dominant area that they did take over was Second Ward. Since the Germans in that area were beginning to move out, it was becoming more available to them, and so they moved into that area. And even early on, they moved in there. There was also the Magnolia Park. They moved there, the Heights. Those were other areas in which the Latino community established. But since we're talking about Second Ward was also one of the main areas where these Latinos began to move into. So they moved into there, and they kind of created what they could in the area as their own community in the early 1910s, just to escape the Civil War. Not that I've covered, the general history of Second Ward and the populations that live there. I want to focus mostly on the Latinos and their history in Second Ward from the 1910s till now. The Germans, they moved out, they sold their properties, and as a result, Second Ward became vacant. More Latinos began to move up there. Mostly they were looking for jobs, but since it became vacant, it became a new hub for Latinos to move into. And this isn't anything new. We've seen this in other communities. Main example of this can be the Midwest, in Kansas City, also in New York, mostly New York, I feel. The main population up in New York were in that area were the Jews, and over time they just moved out, and those areas, those housing buildings, it just became vacant, and as a result Puerto Ricans and other Latinos began to move into that area and began to make that area their own. The same can be said with Latinos in Second Ward. The Latinos began to move into these houses that were already pre-built and these businesses that are already standing there, and they just made it their own. They tried to paint it of their colors, just as we've seen in New York. With the buildings that are already there, they try to make it their own. They try to make the businesses cater to their culture, and as we've seen in New York. But yeah, with those businesses or those vacant buildings already existing, Latinos made it possible for them to just occupy them as a result of just migrating populations. These Latinos, they were very much not welcomed. They were not brought to open arms. They had to fend for themselves in a sense. There wasn't much assistance to them. They had to help each other out. And we've seen that in other communities where, they're not welcome. And as a result, the Latino population, they have to come together and find a way to help each other out. There was still discrimination that they had to face throughout these times. Something that is unfortunately seen in other communities is the segregation and discrimination towards the Latinos. Example is from the oral stories. We hear from Felix Fraga and Alex Fragas that they weren't allowed to play in the same parks as whites. They weren't able to use the same facilities. They knew where to go, but they didn't feel any animosity or anger. For them, it was just a way of living. And it just really shows that it was just a regular for them. Like, oh, okay, I know I can't go there. At least for the brothers. And, there was still some discrimination, not even some, there was discrimination that they were facing. Not able to use certain public spaces. And, we've seen that in other communities. But over time, we've also seen organizations such as LULAC fighting for these Latinos' rights and enable them to use certain amenities and certain places as the Anglo population or the mainstream culture. And we keep seeing more organizations, even current day, popping up, empowering Latino voices and brown voices. Examples, this is many organizations and, the building of Our Lady of Guadalupe Church being built to assist these Latino communities early on. For the Lady of Guadalupe, not only was it a place for Latinos to practice their religions and their own language, since other churches did not want to do that. It was one of the first ones to allow Latinos to come together, congregate, and pray and practice their religion. I want to continue talking about the Second Ward Action Plan. So not only do they want to expand businesses and allow Latinos more economic and job opportunities, especially small businesses, but they also want to expand on education. We've heard from Felix Fragas, his oral story or his story about when he worked at the school board and trying to bring more empowerment and more assistance to Latino schools. And we also heard from his brother on how his mother in the early times of the Second Ward, how she had to basically work at the child care centers, just so her children can just even be at the building. In the Second Ward Action Plan, they want to strengthen local schools, allow the schools to give the students more opportunities, more practice, more after school one-on-one with teachers to hopefully let them participate and engage on whatever educational future they want. Also allow childcare to be more accessible, more easier, not as expensive for Latino parents in that area. They also want to upgrade community facilities, like libraries for children to go to, be able to do their homework, read, check out a book, and whatnot. They also talk about health and not only eating healthy and staying healthy, but also being aware of the hazardous area that they live in. We've talked about the fence line communities. Unfortunately, Second Ward it is not as close to facility plans as other Latino communities in the Houston area, but they still want to acknowledge that, hey, we are close to these industries, these companies where they produce toxic materials that can be detrimental to our health. We should talk about it, let awareness, and also just general health awareness. We see in other communities that these borderline communities are next to these industries that and plants that produce these gases that are bad, just terrible for their health. And at least Second Ward is bringing attention to that, to the Houston area, and how residents can stay healthy. Another thing that is very much important is housing. They want to renovate houses that have been there, let out loans for these houses, and we've seen this in other communities where the government wants to allow and fix the houses in the area. We've seen it in, I believe, in the Oklahoma settlements up in the Middle West, allowing these loans for these houses to be fixed up. They also want to create new housing that is affordable for people, and allowing incentives for those companies that do come and build these affordable housing. And we've seen this and we heard about this in the New York, Latinos in New York, allowing different incentives for companies for allowing affordable housing in that area. Excuse me. And also mobility and infrastructure. Improve the public amenities, allow mobility to be easier for Latinos that don't have a car, that rely on public transportation, allowing it to be safer for them, and also those that have to drive around, like the rail system. And also allowing neighborhoods to be flood resistant, because a huge issue in the Houston area is flooding. Sometimes Houston streets, even with just a little bit of rain, it's enough to cause flooding. And unfortunately, the Second Ward, it is close to the Houston Canal, where there's a bayou next to it. It can allow flooding. So it is also important to talk about making these neighborhoods somewhat flooding resistant to reduce flooding damage in that area. Another important thing that needs to be talked about is supporting the arts, especially graffiti artists or urban artists in that area, and also preserving the historical context of Second Ward. I went to Second Ward a few weeks before Dia de los Muertos. I think it was a week before, and they have, it's the street, and in the middle it is a little shopping strip of local businesses, or people that can local businesses that can put up a tent and sell their items. And there's also, I wasn't able to take a picture of this, but there was also a little plaque talking about giving a brief history of the Latinos in Second Ward. And I feel like they've already started that. They've started preserving the church. They talk about the businesses, and there is graffiti, there is art in that area, which is important. And it is important to inspire and encourage these future artists, because as we've seen in Chicano Park, allowing art to be put there and made there for people to look at can also let people remember of the history of Latinos in that area. And it gives them a sense of encouragement and power, which is important. And just maintaining the history, because at the end of the day, we already started with the oral stories. Allowing that history to be passed down and recorded just so it's not forgotten is very important. But yeah, there is a lot of parallels and similarities of in Second Ward in Houston of Latinos compared to other populations that we've talked about. And it's somewhat reassuring that Second Ward and the grassroots and organizations and just the people living there are putting effort towards hopefully the right direction, for them to be heard, for change to be made in the right way. And hopefully some of that change is happening, but hopefully the change is for the best of the community, and for the Latino population to continue to prosper in that area, which is very much important. And just learning from how other communities weren't able to prosper as much as they wanted. But the Houston area and the Latinos in this Houston area, they're still definitely fighting for rights, fighting for attention, and allowing their community to grow. And the Houston city council people are doing things the right way, I feel. But yeah, the Houston area is just a hub for the Latino culture and other cultures to just grow and be the best it can be.